Did you know there's a pharaoh who's been erased from history? Did you know that in the Middle Ages, being ugly was a crime? Or that a mummy sank the Titanic? All this and much more today on Callan the Curious. Did you know that there was a female pharaoh who they tried to erase from history? Her name was Hatshepsut, and she ruled Egypt for over 20 years, disguising herself as a man to gain acceptance. Under her reign, Egypt prospered with impressive monuments and successful trade routes. But after her death, her stepson Thutmose III ordered her name removed from temples and records, destroyed her statues, and rewritten history as if she had never existed. Why did she do this? Some believe it was out of revenge, others that she simply wanted to reinforce her own legacy. Even so, archaeologists managed to uncover her story, and today she is recognized as one of Egypt's most powerful rulers. Imagine fighting in a war that ended decades ago. That happened to Hiru Onoda, a Japanese soldier sent to the Philippines in 1944 during World War II. His mission was to carry out espionage and sabotage operations in the jungle. When the war ended in 1945, Onoda and his group didn't believe it. They ignored the leaflets dropped from planes announcing the end of the conflict, thinking they were enemy traps. For the next 30 years, he survived in the jungle, stealing food, hunting, and avoiding Filipino patrols. His comrades eventually died, but he continued to resist, convinced that his country still needed him. In 1974, a young adventurer named Norio Suzuki managed to find him and explain the truth. Even so, Onoda refused to give up until his former commander traveled from Japan to give him an official order. When he finally surrendered, his uniform was still in perfect condition and his rifle still worked. After 3 decades of solitary struggle, he returned to Japan as a hero. Pope Leo II is famous for having spent enormous amounts of money on parties and banquets, and even died in a pillow fight. According to some accounts, after a lavish dinner at the Vatican, he and his friends started a pillow fight that ended in tragedy. Others believe his death was due to poisoning, but the story of the pillow fight is recorded. Personally, I prefer the pillow fight version. What do you think happened? I'll read you in the comments. Wars have been fought over territory, wealth, and power. But once upon a time, a war was fought over a simple wooden bucket. In 1325, the Italian cities of Modena and Bologna were enemies. It all erupted when soldiers from Modena stole a wooden bucket from a well in Bologna. Although it may have seemed like a joke, the Bolognese took it very seriously and demanded the bucket back. Modena refused, and instead of returning it, they displayed it as a mocking trophy. Bologna, furious, declared war and assembled an army of 32,000 soldiers to recover the bucket. The battle, called the Battle of Zappolino, was a real and bloody confrontation. Modena won the war and not only kept the bucket, but also humiliated Bologna by invading its territory. The most incredible thing is that the bucket is still in Modena to this day, kept in a museum as a reminder of this absurd war. Have you ever heard of Tutankhamun? You most likely have, as he is one of the most famous pharaohs in the world. A study of the pharaoh's remains revealed that he suffered from many health problems. He had crooked teeth and hips, temporal lobe epilepsy, and a painful foot problem that likely caused him to limp, called Kohler's disease. Tutankhamun was far from being godlike, as pharaohs were considered in ancient Egypt. Interestingly, that same study revealed the reason for all his health problems. Tutankhamun's parents were siblings. Yes, as you read, Tutankhamun was the product of incest. Who would have thought it, right? If you like the video, give me a nice like. Don't forget to leave your suggestions, questions, or opinions in the comments below. Subscribe and activate the bell so you don't miss more videos like this. Remember that it doesn't cost you anything, it's free, and you help me a lot. Let's continue with the curiosities. Can you imagine the Colosseum in Rome filled with water to recreate naval battles? Yes, you heard right. In its early years, the Colosseum not only hosted gladiators, but also naval battle shows, called naumachia. The Colosseum was filled with water, and great historical naval battles were reenacted to the delight and joy of those attending, thus producing clashes between the great Egyptian, Greek, or Persian fleets. The creator of these spectacles, or the first to stage these magnificent displays, was Julius Caesar, who organized the first battle in 46 BC. The naumachia was one of the most impressive and expensive spectacles held at the Colosseum, and attracted large crowds of spectators. During World War I, British spies used invisible ink to send secret messages. But there was a problem. Traditional methods were easily detected. It was then that they discovered an unexpected ingredient: human semen. British intelligence discovered that semen was an invisible ink, undetectable by enemy methods. Thus, the code, "the ink that's always fresh," was born. But the problem arose when spies had to always carry a personal reserve to write messages at any time. Could you imagine this method of espionage? American novelist Morgan Robertson published the novel The Wreck of the Titan. In this fictional book, the Titan is an ocean liner that sinks one night in the North Atlantic after colliding with an iceberg while traveling at high speed. Despite being the largest and most luxurious ocean liner of its time, it is described as unsinkable. Lacking enough lifeboats, the Titan sinks, with only 13 of its occupants surviving. These facts would be unremarkable if the novel were not published in 1898, 14 years before the sinking of the Titanic. In Spain, there is a very peculiar medieval bridge, the Stone Bridge of Zaragoza, built in the 15th century. During its construction, the masons ran out of lime for the cement mix. Desperate to find a solution, they decided to use eggs in the mix, since egg whites, when dried, help harden the materials. The story goes that thousands of eggs were collected from nearby villages, and that thanks to this, the bridge was completed and has stood for centuries. The bridge still stands after wars, floods, and hundreds of years of history. Some believe it's just a myth, but others claim that eggs were the secret to its durability. Did you know that the ancient Egyptians already had something similar to pizza, thousands of years before the Italian recipe was born? The Egyptians prepared what could be considered a flatbread with flour, water, and oil. Simple ingredients such as olive oil, herbs, and garlic were added to this bread. This rudimentary recipe was very common among the lower classes and was used as an accessible and quick form of food. The loaves were baked in clay ovens, and then these basic ingredients were added. This flatbread, although lacking modern pizza toppings like tomato or cheese, can be considered a precursor to pizza. Like modern pizzas, the Egyptians used their flatbread as a base to experiment with different toppings, which shows that the idea of combining bread with other foods has been around for centuries. Although the concept of pizza, as we know it today, originated in Naples, Italy, in the late 18th century, the Egyptians were already using bread as a base for various toppings long. The Romans found several uses for urine, which was highly valued in tanneries for tanning hides, as the high pH of the ammonia contained in urine softened the leather and also helped remove traces of flesh and hair. Urine also had other, somewhat more bizarre uses, one of which was its use as a mouthwash. In this case, again, ammonia provided an advantage, as this compound is one of the best cleaning agents in existence. The liquid gold became so sought after that the emperor's officials imposed a tax on it. When you see a white flag in battle, you probably think of surrender, but has it always meant that? In ancient Rome, soldiers used a spear with a white cloth on it, not to surrender, but to negotiate peace. It was a way of showing they were willing to talk without fighting. Over time, in China and Europe, the white flag began to be associated with complete surrender. During the 30 Years' War in the 17th century, it was officially established as a symbol of surrender in combat. It sounds like a joke, but there was once a time in history when the British Army had to fight off a rabbit invasion. It all began in 1859, when a man named Thomas Austin decided to bring 24 rabbits from England to Australia. His idea was to keep them for hunting, little imagining it would unleash one of the worst plagues in history. The rabbits multiplied uncontrollably because they had no natural predators in Australia. Within a few years, there were millions of them, destroying crops, eating vegetation, and endangering local wildlife. Finally, the British government declared an official war on the rabbits and sent 30,000 soldiers to wipe them out. The result? To this day, they remain a pest in Australia and are considered one of the worst ecological mistakes in history. In 1815, one of the most absurd battles in history occurred. France surrendered to itself. After Napoleon's defeat, a small French fortress on Guadeloupe hadn't received word that the war was over. When British ships arrived, the French surrendered without a fight, believing they were still at war. But the funny thing is, since Guadeloupe had already been returned to France in a treaty, the soldiers basically surrendered to their own country. Can you imagine surrendering without even knowing you'd won? You might be surprised by the ads from 50 or 80 years ago. They were very strange. Heroin for children, the perfect syrup. Between 1890 and 1910, the pharmaceutical company Bayer sold heroin in bottles to relieve coughs and similar ailments. Years later, they discovered the addiction caused by heroin, and production of this bottle was discontinued in 1913. I found this case quite interesting. The story goes that in 1903, a prisoner named Will West arrived at the Leavenworth Penitentiary. The admitting officer took routine photographs, just like they show in movies. He then asked Will West if he had been to the prison before. His face looked familiar, but Will replied that he hadn't. It was his first time in a jail. The officer wasn't convinced by his answer, so he checked the records and brought back other photographs of a man named William West. His surprise was that the two men were identical, but they weren't the same man and weren't even related. Two identical men with similar names and sentenced to the same prison. What were the odds? Because of this incident, better measures began to be taken to keep track of identities so that photographs and measurements wouldn't be enough. From then on, fingerprints began to be used as the primary means of identification, eventually becoming what it is today. In the 9th century, Pope Stephen VI did something completely unusual. He brought out the corpse of his predecessor, Pope Formosus, to be tried in a tribunal. He was dressed in papal robes and seated in a chair. A monk had to answer on his behalf while he was accused of various crimes. Of course, the trial was a sham, and the corpse was found guilty. His punishment: his fingers were torn off, he was stripped naked, and his body was thrown into the Tiber River. This event, known as the Cadaver Synod, remains one of the most gruesome episodes in Vatican history. If you are not yet a member of the channel, subscribe! This is the perfect time to do so. The global tomato ketchup market was valued at $20.5 billion in 2023. This ocean of tomato sauce was primarily used to accompany the 50 billion hamburgers, along with their inseparable fries, consumed annually around the world. Ketchup has been around since the fruit first emerged in the Andes, although it was the Spanish who arrived in Mexico who gave it its name. Ketchup is basically a mixture of tomato, vinegar, and sugar, and its modern formula was invented in 1876 by American Henry John Heinz. Initially, Heinz experimented with peaches and apples until he was convinced that tomato was best. But did you know that in the 18th century, ketchup was marketed as a medicine to treat indigestion and jaundice? It could also be taken in pill form. Curious, right? The least that most people associate with the mummification process and mummies themselves is a good smell. However, a study published in August 2023 in the journal Scientific Reports revealed that mummies smelled very good, at least when the bodies were mummified. The research recreated the liquids used by ancient Egyptian embalmers to preserve bodies, and archaeologist Barbara Heath, a member of the team, said that the dominant fragrance is definitely a woody, pine-like aroma, but it also has a hint of bitumen, a little beeswax, some sweetness, and you might even catch a fresh, citrusy pistachio note, so it's a very pleasant smell. This is a description you might expect in a tasting note of a good wine, but never from a mummy, wouldn't you say? In the 15th century, the Italian city of Florence had many strange rules, but one of the craziest was a law against ugliness. If someone had an appearance considered unpleasant or frightening, they could be fined or even expelled from the city. Some historians believe this law was used to prevent people with serious illnesses or deformities from being in public. Today, such a law would be totally unthinkable. But in medieval Florence, being ugly was literally a crime. A Christmas Carol, Charles Dickens' most famous work, is populated by ghosts. Although the English writer was skeptical about the existence of these creatures, many believers in the 19th and much of the 20th centuries believed in them. In contrast, his no less famous Scottish colleague, Arthur Conan Doyle, creator of Sherlock Holmes, believed not only in ghosts, but also in fairies and other supernatural beings. In 1862, the Ghost Club, a society for the investigation of paranormal phenomena, was founded in London. It is considered the first organization of its kind in the world. The club studied several cases of alleged ghost appearances and accepted both skeptical and believer members. 2 of its first membership cards were issued in the names of Charles Dickens and Arthur Conan Doyle, as both were members of the club. And you? Do you believe ghosts exist? Have you ever had a paranormal experience? Tell me about it in the comments. The yo-yo dates back to ancient Greece, where it was so revered that the ancient Greeks incorporated it into their paintings and other works of art for posterity. The earliest depiction of a yo-yo is found on a Greek vase from the 5th century BC, which depicts a child playing with the timeless toy. Yo-yos of that time were made of wood, metal, or clay, and it is believed that the ancient Greeks played with them as an offering to the gods and as an ancient coming-of-age ritual for children. The yo-yo's origins date back to China, from where it spread to ancient Greece and the Philippines, eventually becoming a popular toy worldwide. The Eiffel Tower, one of the world's most famous and iconic monuments, was originally designed as a temporary structure. Yes, you heard right. The Eiffel Tower wasn't always meant to be in Paris forever. The tower was created by engineer Gustave Eiffel and his team for the 1889 Paris World's Fair, an event celebrating the centennial of the French Revolution. Initially, the tower was only meant to last 20 years, with plans to dismantle it after the exposition. But something incredible happened. The tower became so popular and useful that instead of destroying it, the French decided to keep it. Its usefulness was key in this decision. In the 1910s, the tower began to be used to transmit radio signals, making it even more valuable to the city. It's impressive to think that something that was designed as a temporary structure for a special event ended up becoming one of the most recognizable monuments on the planet. Did you know that there were also female gladiators in the Roman Empire? Although they were much less common than men, these brave fighters braved the dangers of the arena to entertain the public. They were known as gladiatrices, and like their male counterparts, they fought with swords, shields, and light armor. They often fought each other, or against wild animals in spectacles organized for the Roman elite. Among the most famous gladiators are Amazona and Achillea, whose names were found in an ancient inscription. Their combat was said to be so impressive that they were granted their freedom after the fight. However, eventually, Emperor Septimius Severus banned female gladiators in the 3rd century AD, ending their participation in the games. What do you think of these ancient warrior women? Let me know in the comments. In the Czech Republic, there's a chilling place, Sedlec Church, also known as the Bone Church. It's named after its decoration made of human bones. Skull chandeliers, femur crosses, and more than 40,000 skeletons decorate the place. This macabre church was built in the 14th century and remains one of the creepiest destinations in the world. Would you visit such a place? Let me know in the comments. Did you know that Victorian Britons ate arsenic to pale their faces? Arsenic was a common component in the manufacture of fabrics, wallpaper, cosmetics, foods, and medicines during the Victorian era. The economic expansion resulting from the Industrial Revolution led to women engaging in a real competition for the title of Best Dressed, unaware that the rags they wore were poisonous. The ideal of beauty in Victorian times was a pale complexion, and women hoped to achieve it by applying arsenic-based makeup and eating foods containing the poisonous substance. The pyramids at Giza weren't always brown. The pyramids, built as tombs for the pharaohs of ancient Egypt, were covered with a layer of polished white limestone. This coating reflected the sun, making the pyramids shine like beacons in the desert. Over the centuries, stones were stolen or eroded, exposing the stone structure, resulting in the brown color. Samurai are a symbol of Japan, but there was one very special one, Yasuke, the African samurai. He arrived in Japan in the 16th century with Portuguese traders, and his appearance amazed everyone, including the powerful feudal lord, Oda Nobunaga. Impressed by his strength and intelligence, Nobunaga made him his bodyguard, and later an official samurai. He was the first black samurai in history, and his legacy lives on in Japan to this day. Although Saudi Arabia is known today for its connection to coffee, the first coffee beans were cultivated in Ethiopia, long before it was known in the Arab world. The most popular legend tells of a shepherd named Kaldi, living in the mountains of Ethiopia, who discovered coffee by accident. Kaldi noticed that his goats became very energetic after eating some red berries from a bush. Curious, he tried the berries himself and soon felt a similar sense of energy. Kaldi, seeing the effects, took the berries to a local monk, who boiled them and made a drink from them. The monk found that this beverage kept him awake during long hours of prayer, and so it began to spread. Although the Arabs were the first to cultivate coffee commercially and brought it across trade routes, it was the Ethiopians who discovered it and began using it in their rituals long before that. Today, Ethiopia remains one of the largest coffee producers. Columbus is famous for discovering America in 1492. But did you know that the Vikings arrived 500 years earlier? In the 11th century, explorer Leif Erikson, son of Eric the Red, sailed from Greenland to what is now Canada. He named this territory Vinland because they found so many wild grapes. The Vikings set up camps in the area, but couldn't stay long. They clashed with Native Americans, whom they called Skraelings, and eventually abandoned the area. In 1960, archaeologists found remains of these settlements in Newfoundland, confirming that the Vikings were in America before Columbus. The Greeks were very advanced for their time, creating systems of government and inventing the Olympic Games. But they could sometimes be somewhat scatterbrained in their methods of diagnosing illnesses. It was Hippocrates himself who began diagnosing his patients using earwax. In addition to examining its color and texture, he also tasted it. After cleaning the person's ear, the father of medicine would taste the earwax, and if it was sweet, it suggested a problem. Bitter wax, on the other hand, was a sign of good health. Honestly, I wouldn't have liked to be a doctor back then. Would you? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Between the 1912 and 1918 editions, the Olympic Games held competitions and awarded medals in the fine arts, in categories such as painting, sculpture, architecture, literature, and music. Participating works had to have an Olympic theme. This custom was adopted based on the fact that the Greeks held artistic festivals during the ancient Olympics. During this Olympic period of artistic awards, 151 medals were awarded. Would you like to see these artistic categories compete again at the Olympic Games? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Imagine signing up for a bicycle race and taking 13 years to finish it. It seems unbelievable, but this happened to a French cyclist named Pierre Gauchard. It all began in 1914, when a cycling competition was held in France. Gauchard was one of the participants, but during the race, he suffered an accident and couldn't continue. Frustrated, he dropped out of the competition and moved on with his life. But the story didn't end there. Years passed, and in 1927, he decided to finish what he had started. Although the race had been over for more than a decade, Gauchard took his bicycle and completed the course on his own. When he reached the finish line, the organizers accepted his arrival as an official, making him the cyclist with the longest career in history. Although he didn't technically win, his perseverance made him a legend. Did you know that the blood of Roman gladiators was used to treat epilepsy and their sweat was used as an aphrodisiac? Roman gladiators had a very short life expectancy as part of a flourishing industry for the morbid entertainment of the elites, ordinary citizens, and slaves of imperial Rome. There was an industry surrounding them as their weapons and clothing became valuable objects, and their blood was believed to be medicinal. Pliny the Elder, a Roman historian from the 1st century AD, wrote, "Epileptics drink the blood of gladiators as if it were the potion of life. After fights in which they survived, the gladiators' sweat was not lost. It was collected and sold in small bottles worth a fortune, as it was considered an aphrodisiac." Prejudice against new things has existed since the beginning of time, and mass-consumed foods, which are part of humanity's dietary foundation, such as corn, potatoes, and tomatoes, took several centuries to be accepted. Without any basis, some foods, before becoming popular, were rejected as poisonous or harmful. Perhaps the best-known case is that of the tomato, which was the subject of a curious story. In 1820, Salem, New Jersey, farmer Robert Gaben Johnson was irritated with his neighbors, who rejected his beautiful tomatoes, calling them toxic. The farmer did not sit idly by, and one day he went to the Salem courthouse with a basket of the tomatoes and ate it all, proving to his fellow citizens that the fruit was not deadly. Did you know that the first map of the known world was created by the Babylonians over 2,500 years ago? This ancient map not only shows us the first attempt to depict the known world, but also reflects how the Babylonians viewed their universe. The map in question was engraved on a clay tablet and was discovered in Iraq in the 19th century. This tablet, known as the Babylonian map, does not show the world as we know it today, but rather features Babylon at the center, with a series of symbols and figures representing places, mountains, and rivers around the city. The Babylonians considered their city to be the center of the universe, which explains why it is located at the center of this map. This map, although rudimentary, marks an important milestone in the history of cartography and shows us how early civilizations attempted to give shape and meaning to the places around them. Can you imagine owning the moon and charging NASA for parking there? Well, this is exactly what a man named Genaro Gajardo, an Argentine lawyer and poet, attempted to do when, in 1953, he declared that the moon belonged to him. At that time, some countries could claim land that had no registered owner. Gajardo took advantage of this loophole and registered the moon in his name in Chile. Incredibly, his claim was granted, and he became the supposed owner of Earth's natural satellite. Of course, this title deed wasn't internationally valid, but that didn't stop Gajardo from becoming famous for his absurd, yet ingenious, claim. When NASA began sending missions to the moon in the 1960s and 1970s, Gajardo joked that he should be paid to use his land. But the most curious thing is that even after his death in 1998, some people have continued to send invoices to NASA on behalf of his family, demanding payment for the misuse of the moon. Obviously, NASA hasn't paid a cent, but this man's story remains one of the funniest anecdotes about space exploration. Wars can last for years, but did you know there was one that only lasted 38 minutes? It happened on August 27, 1896, between the United Kingdom and the Sultanate of Zanzibar, a small nation on the coast of Africa. It all began when Sultan Hamad bin Thuwaini, who maintained good relations with the British, died suddenly. His successor, Khalid bin Bargash, took power without British approval. But the British were not at all happy with his choice. Within a day, they sent warships and gave him an ultimatum: surrender or face attack. Khalid refused, and at 9:02 a.m., the British opened fire. They bombarded the Sultan's palace, destroyed his fleet, and left more than 500 casualties on the Zanzibar side. By 9:40 a.m., the war was over. The Sultan fled, and Zanzibar was under British control. Although toilet paper is something we take for granted today, its history is much more interesting than it seems. The first documented use of toilet paper dates back to the 6th century in China. At that time, people used all kinds of objects to clean themselves, from plant leaves to stones, fabrics, or even, according to some ancient texts, turtle shells. However, Emperor Yang of the Sui dynasty was one of the first to use a type of paper specially designed for this purpose. The first documented reference comes from a literary work from 589 AD, which mentioned the use of toilet paper in the imperial court. The most curious thing is that initially only emperors and the aristocracy could afford this luxury. The toilet paper used by emperors was said to be fragrant and luxurious. Over time, the use of toilet paper spread to the lower classes, and by the 14th century, during the Ming dynasty, huge quantities of paper were produced for this purpose, which were eventually distributed throughout the country. Over the centuries, toilet paper was perfected and gradually spread throughout the rest of the world, becoming a basic necessity in today's homes. Can you imagine an Egyptian mummy could have sunk the Titanic? In 1912, before the Titanic's voyage, a British archaeologist acquired an Egyptian mummy with an inscription that read, "I will awaken from death and bring destruction to whoever possesses me." The mummy was said to have been in the Titanic's hold when it set sail, and we already know what happened. Although this story is unconfirmed, many believe the mummy's curse was real. What do you think? Let me know in the comments. In ancient Rome, roses were not only prized for their beauty and fragrance, but they also held a very special meaning. When used in meetings or banquets, roses were considered to symbolize secrecy and confidentiality. The custom of using roses as a symbol of privacy and discretion led to the expression sub rosa, which literally means under the rose. This phrase referred to the idea that any conversation or agreement made under the sign of a rose should be kept secret. This tradition also transcended throughout history, and the phrase sub rosa continues to be used in several languages to refer to something that should be kept secret or confidential, especially in business or political contexts. In the Middle Ages, cats were persecuted by the Church. It all began with Pope Gregory IV, who in 1233 published a document called Vox in Rama, in which he stated that black cats were associated with the devil and witchcraft. This declaration led many people in Europe to kill thousands of cats, especially black ones. They considered them companions of witches and symbols of evil. What no one imagined was that this cat hunt would have devastating consequences. With the decline in the feline population, rats began to multiply uncontrollably, which contributed to the spread of the dreaded Black Death in the 14th century. The plague, transmitted by rat fleas, killed almost a third of the European population. This event is a clear example of how superstitions can lead to unexpected consequences. That's all for today. See you in the next video.